Good morning, everyone. Welcome back from your small groups. I hope you enjoyed that time discussing this lesson 5 together. We are in Exodus, the promises of Moses, in lesson 5 of our Christian story course. So let's review where we have come. Here's our plot arc. Hopefully you're very familiar with it now. We started off the story with the setting and things were good. And then the fall, we have sin's consequences come on the world, brokenness in relationship with God and others, and a struggle to do what we're called to do as image bearers of God. And we saw the problem is the human heart and that sin that's inside us. And then we saw that God starts to work on getting us back to the end. How are we going to get to this new earth where sin and death are defeated? And we learned that God is going to do this by working alongside people through a series of promises. And so last week we looked at the promises to Abraham, and this week we are looking at how those promises are continued and expanded on and clarified through promises to Moses. So as we were doing this study and I was thinking about how we were going to teach through this and review this, it made me think about the summer of grade 11 when I went to a French immersion school called St. Anne's in Nova Scotia. And when I went there, I had to pack up my stuff, move, go be there, be a student in the school, be a French immersion student, and part of that meant signing a commitment to follow the rules of this school. Or I would be kicked out. I couldn't stay. And so I had to sign this commitment that I would speak French at all times, that I would follow curfews, that I would attend class, or I'd get sent home. So I had to sign this agreement in order to be part of this community. In a similar way, we've seen in this last week of study, and we're going to see it continue, that God is bringing his people out, and he's giving them this set of rules, this way to live, to be his people. And we're going to see that they too are called to agree and sign this agreement to be these people who God is calling them to be. So we're going to start off by just reviewing our homework. We saw that the solution of God started off with God rescuing and God reshaping his people. So it starts off with this rescue mission again. Similar to what we saw in the story of Noah and the flood, God initiated a rescue for his people, and he's made promises to them. In Exodus 19, 4 and 5, it says that you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. They had this promise of the Lord. He rescued them as his treasured possession out of Egypt, brought them on eagle's wings, and they just had to have faith and follow. And so we see God's hand in rescue and their faithful obedience. Just like Noah had to follow the obedience or the instructions of God to be saved, so they did as well. And we hear God's desire for them, his love for them in this rescue as he initiates his plan. And then we saw that God reshaped them. And he reshaped them in 3 days. He reshaped them through identity and as image bearers, and he motivates them in this. So he gave them this new identity. He called them a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. Now remember the promises that God gave to Abraham. He gave promises about descendants, about a land, and blessing for them personally, relationship with God, and blessing that they would bless those around them, the nations. Now, in this story of the Exodus, as we've traveled along the plot arc, we see some of these blessings coming to pass. So when Israel went down to Egypt, they were about 70 people, Jacob and his sons. But when they came out of Egypt, it says that in Exodus 12:37, that there was about 600,000 men, not including the women and children. Estimates about how many people probably were in this crowd are around 2 million or more. So God has fulfilled and is fulfilling the first part of the promise, these many descendants. They have exploded into what is becoming a great nation of people. And the second blessing, the land, they are on their way to their land. They were enslaved in Egypt, and now they're heading on their way to Canaan. And then we saw the blessing of relationship and the blessing to other nations. So we hear that, those promises being reflected in God calling them a treasured possession, this relationship with him, and to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, to bless the nations around them through what God is calling them to be, this new identity. He also calls them to be image bearers. And that's what I think we see reflected in the commandments, in these laws that God gives them to love him, worship him rightly, and to love others. He's giving them the opportunity to be what they were supposed to be again in the garden. What they lost in the struggle of broken relationships, God's saying, if you follow these commands, this is how humans are supposed to live, how they're supposed to bless those around them. God didn't rescue them just from something, he rescued them for something, to show them how to be image bearers of him, to show the world what it means to reflect God's character as we were originally created to be. He also motivates them. We saw that in your homework. He motivated them through grace by this rescuing act. When he gives them the commands, he first reminds them, hey, I rescued you, I love you, I treasure you. So in response to that, you should obey what I have to say to you. This should motivate you to obey me because of my love for you. He also motivated them through fear. And you looked at that text where Israel is at the bottom of this mountain and God comes in great and awesome power to them. I think it's helpful for us to take a second and imagine being an Israelite. You've grown up for years in Egypt, hearing stories maybe about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and these promises that were supposed to come. Maybe you know a little bit about Adam and Eve and the flood, but really, you don't know much about this God. You've spent your life in Egypt, surrounded by Egyptian gods and the culture, but you know you're different, and you live a different way, and you're enslaved and have suffered. The promises maybe feel a little bit like hearsay, and where is this God, and who is he really? Well, then some crazy stuff starts happening. Moses shows up, there's plagues, and you pack up your stuff and you leave and you walk through the Red Sea and you're traveling along and you come to this mountain and then you're told to consecrate yourself because you're going to meet this God. And then he shows up and proves who he is. And you're standing there with your family and there is thunder and lightning and clouds descend and smoke billows up. There is an earthquake, and then a trumpet blast that grows louder and louder, and then a voice speaks. No wonder they trembled. No wonder they said, Moses, you be our advocate. You be the mediator. This incredible moment was given to them so that they would know who their God was, that they would fear him and tremble before him. He is not the silent stone idols of Egypt. He is different. He is powerful and holy. And this was to motivate them to live according to these laws so that they could be this nation who would bless the world by reflecting God in how they act and lived. Their calling as a treasured possession, as a kingdom of priests, as a holy nation was a high calling, and it was a heavy responsibility. And so God is giving them the tools to live that out through the grace of his rescue and the fear of who he is. And reverence in that. Hopefully you had time as you worked through that in your homework or with your groups to kind of apply that to our own lives and how does it look for us to properly fear God and live in reverence of him? Because we can't take him lightly either. So we're going to move from our homework into some new texts today, this morning. And if you flip in your books to page 56, you'll see two headings: the covenant with Moses ratified and the covenant with Moses broken. And that's what we're going to work through over the next few minutes. You'll see on page 57 that Exodus 24 is listed there. So we've skipped a few chapters in between Exodus 20 with the 10 Commandments and Exodus 24. What happens in those chapters is more laws, more explanations of how Israel is supposed to live as a representative of God. So then we read in Exodus 24, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him." When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Then Moses wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in the bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you, in accordance with all these words." So the first point we're looking at here is the covenant of Moses ratified. To ratify means to sign or give formal consent, making something official and valid. It has to do with treaties and contracts. So this is where we are seeing the covenant, this promise that God said, you'll be a kingdom of priests if you obey my covenant. Here is where it's made official. And we see a few things in this ceremony. We see that there is worship, there is a declaration of obedience, and there is blood. So in the ceremony, we see worships. The elders are worshiping on the mountain. The young men offer burnt offerings, and they offer fellowship offerings. These would have had to do with atonement and also celebration for the fellowship, the relationship that they had with God. This was a time of rejoicing that they are in this commitment with the Lord. We also see obedience. So this is where we talked about there's a difference between this covenant and the covenant with Abraham. Crystal taught us last week that the covenant with Abraham depended solely on God. He walked through those animal halves and said, no matter what, I will see these promises through. You will be blessed in these ways. But in this one, we see that there's an if and a then, and that Israel has to agree to obey the rules. Moses reads the laws to the people, and they say, we will obey. But we have to realize that this isn't two equal parties coming with what they have to offer and making an agreement. This is God initiating this covenant. It's his laws. In verse 8, you see that this is the blood of the covenant the Lord has made with you, and he's inviting them into this relationship. If they would like to be this kingdom of priests, this holy nation, this is how they have to do it, and they must obey in order to receive these blessings. It's like when you get a manual in order to put together a piece of IKEA furniture. You want the end product, but you have to follow the instructions that God gives, the instructions that the owners give, the manufacturers give to build it. And so they have to follow the instructions God gives them to be this kingdom of priests, to receive this blessing. Lastly, we see the blood of the covenant. This blood is sprinkled on the altar, and it's sprinkled on the people. The blood signified that the covenant was binding, that they were now the Lord's people. They were his, and they agreed to live in this way. They say twice, we will obey. They are part of this covenant. And so the covenant is ratified, formally agreed to. They've seen God and his presence on the mountain. They've worshiped, trembled, and they are covenant and promised to God to be his people, his treasured possession, and his holy nation. But then the covenant is broken. We're going to move ahead to Exodus 32. In between these chapters, again, we aren't going to get into those, but what happens is Moses is up on the mountain with God. At the end of Exodus 24, it says that Moses entered the cloud again on top of the mountain. The glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire, and Moses walked up there, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And while he was up there, God was giving him more instructions. He was actually giving him instructions on how to worship him, instructions on how to build the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and the holy objects of worship, what the priesthood was going to look like. So God was giving Moses all of these instructions about worship, proper worship to him. And we'll learn more about that in the coming days, or you can go back and read those chapters after today. So while God is having this conversation, giving instructions to Moses about worship, we go back to the camp and we see Exodus 32, what is happening here. We see the covenant broken already. Exodus 32, you can read it along on page 57. Verse 1 says, "When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up from Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." Just like we learned with the story of the flood and Noah and his sons, they so quickly fell back into sin. Even after this display of God's power, our hearts are so quick to turn to evil. And so we see a perversion of worship, we'll see disobedience, and again, we will see blood as the story continues. So in verse 2, we see Aaron responding. He says, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day, the people rose early, sacrificed burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Did you notice that they do the same things that just earlier they had done in their covenant ratification ceremony with the Lord? They build an altar, they sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to this idol. They've perverted worship while the mountain is right there. It's still smoking. Moses is up there. But they are doubtful and dismayed because he's taking too long. They say, "We don't know what's happened to him." Think of it like, have you ever, when you were a kid, that your parent forgot you at school or somewhere, or maybe you've been that parent that's forgotten your kid, or you're late to pick them up. And at first, as a kid, you're scared and maybe a bit panicked because you're not sure what to do. And then maybe your parent texts you and they're stuck in the lineup at Costco. And then as you're sitting there, you become angry and impatient and you're frustrated. And instead of just waiting and trusting, maybe you start walking home, or you look for someone else to get a ride with, or you find yourself a new parent. Our attitude that quickly switches to one of distrust and frustration. And we see the people here, instead of waiting in the unknown for Moses to come back, they turn to something else. They find a new solution, and they turn and find a new God. They worship their idol in the same way as God made the covenant with him, in the same way that they made their covenant with God with offerings. They pervert that ceremony that they've just promised to obey, and they disobey this, one of the very first rules he gave them, to not make an image. While Moses is learning about true worship on the mountain, they are perverting worship at the bottom. And God is aware of what is going on, and he sees their disobedience. So in verse 7 through 10, we read, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go down, because your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." So they've disobeyed, and that equals breaking the covenant. Remember, they just agreed, if we want to be in this covenant, we will obey. But immediately, so soon, they have disobeyed, and the covenant is broken. God justly is angered with them. He justly can destroy them because they have not agreed. And we see this heartbreaking words where he disassociates with them. Instead of calling them his treasured possession, he says to Moses, "Your people, these people." We see already how the ramifications of their disobedience have broken this covenant, and God is now free to wipe them out. He can still keep his promises to Abraham. He'll just start over with Moses, and that would have been just. And yet, this doesn't happen. I'm not going to read all of the text, but you can read it on your own sometime, but I'm going to just summarize what goes on here. Moses seeks the favor of the Lord and asks, have mercy on them. Don't destroy them again. For your name's sake, have mercy on them. And the Lord relents, and he doesn't bring disaster on the people. And Moses goes down and confronts Aaron. And Moses is angry. And he asks Aaron, what have you done? And Aaron, classic, like we've seen before, shifts the blame to other people. He blames it on the people who are prone to evil. He kind of seems to blame it on Moses, who was taking too long on the mountain. He doesn't take ownership. He says in verse 24, they gave me the gold and I threw it in the fire and out came this calf. He doesn't take ownership for his act here. And Moses says that he saw the people were running wild and that Aaron had let them get out of control and they were becoming a laughingstock to their enemies. So quickly, when we turn from obeying the Lord, things go crazy. Sin multiplies, and now they are a laughingstock. And so in this moment, Moses calls out to the people, who is for the Lord? And the tribe of Levi gathers to him, one of the tribes of Israel, and they go out and they actually put to death 3,000 people, their brothers, their neighbors, their friends, to end the revelry, to end the sinful behavior. And blood is shed of their own people in this disobedient act. And then we'll read in verse 30 through 35. The next day, Moses said to the people, you have committed a great sin, but now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses went back to the Lord and said, oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold, but now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. The Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin. And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. So in these verses, we see that sin requires atonement. So quickly we saw that the people turned and disobeyed this covenant. So how are they going to keep going? How are they going to receive these blessings? This was looking like it was going to go well. God gave them these laws. They say, we're going to obey. This is going to be great. We're headed to the land. We're going to be God's holy nation. And yet so quickly they turned away. How are they going to keep these things and not face this again? We need atonement. We need something to cover and appease and cleanse us, to reconcile us with God again. Because we have learned the human heart is always turned to sin, that sin is going to come up in them. And what they've done deserves to nullify the promises. And so what's to stop them from doing it again? We can see that this story tells us there's still a problem. There's still something needed. The heart problem still remains. And so Moses goes up and says, maybe I can make atonement for you. He asks God, will you forgive their sin? But if not, take me instead. He tries to offer himself, but God says, no, you can't do it. Whoever sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Each of us is responsible for our own sin. Each of the Israelites needed something to atone for their sin. This is a little foreshadowing into what we need, a Savior who's better than Moses, who's going to atone for our sin. And next week, we're going to learn more about the solution to this, what it means, how is this covenant going to be continued, is these promises to Moses. This is part 2 of the story. Because the problem of the heart issue still remains as God continues to work with these people. And we see God's grace continue to remain because he doesn't nullify the promises yet. He says, go, keep leading them, keep going towards the land. My angel will go before you. But punishment will come. And so where does this leave us today? On this cliffhanger of what's next? How is this going to be solved? And yet, what can we learn today for our own application? This story is a crazy, vivid illustration of our own struggle, of how our willingness to obey actually shows whether we are in relationship with God or not, whether we are truly his in this covenant. Israel was called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And in 1 Peter 2:9, we are called a chosen people. a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. As Christians, you are called to declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. But is your relationship to God just lip service? Do you say, I will do everything you say, and yet quickly turn away? With God and this relationship, obedience isn't an option. It's our calling as his child. It's our responsibility as his priests to reflect his character to the world. But it's also not a burden. It is a flourishing way to live if we live in obedience to the Lord. And the beautiful thing is that we have Jesus Christ who has set us free so that we can have victory over sin. And yes, when we mess up, we can find forgiveness through his blood. And yet I know we still struggle to obey today. We struggle to reflect God's character, just like Israel did. Maybe what Israel did at the bottom of the mountain in their moment of doubt strikes a chord with you because maybe it's been a while since you felt close to God and felt his presence. This pandemic maybe has felt long and you've grown weary of not being with others or worshiping together. Can I encourage you to look at the motivations that God gave to Israel to follow him? The motivation of his grace and rescue. Think of your salvation. Think back to the gospel truth of what he's done for you. He holds you. Help that motivate you to love and obedience. Turn on some worship music when you're in those moments of doubt and turn your heart to praise and gratefulness for what he has done. And God also motivated them with reverent fear of who he is. So in those moments, you are not stuck at the bottom of the mountain. You are welcomed into the throne room to pray to the Lord. You have Jesus Christ as your mediator and intercessor. In those moments when you need him, get on your knees and pray, or open his word. Get to know him more that you may grow in reverent fear and awe of him. Go outside at night. See if you can count those stars and humble yourself for the one who can. Or if you live around here in Abbotsford, register for a church service and join us outside in the tents. Be among people who are also struggling to know God and obey him. Pursue the Lord. Do not look for a substitute. As we seek to obey him, pursue him and see that he's given you these gifts to motivate you of grace and reverent fear of him. Remember that nothing you can do or don't do will take away his love for you, and rest in that. Cling to it. I'm going to pray for us as we then head off into our groups to discuss. God, I thank you so much for who you are, for your word that teaches us step by step how you have shown us your plan for salvation and our need for you. God, I pray that you will help us to love you and to know you and obey you. Help us to reflect your character, to be the priests who worship you rightly and who show the world what it means to love you. We pray this in your son's name. Amen. You can head to your groups.